Many have long known that people of color are treated differently by our justice system, but a new study is shining a light on just how broad the problems are at every step of the way, from arrest to incarceration. Researchers with the Criminal Justice Policy Program at Harvard Law School found that while black people make up just 6.5% of the state's population, they account for roughly 17% of its criminal cases. And Latinx people, who make up just under 9% of the population, account for more than 18% of cases. Black and Latinx people also are less likely to have their cases thrown out or some sort of deal reached before trial. And once they're convicted, if they are, both groups are generally given much longer sentences than their white neighbors, even when they committed the exact same crime. Researchers dug into several other factors they thought might help explain the discrepancies, but their analysis showed that, quote, one factor, racial and ethnic differences in the type and severity of initial charge, accounts for over 70% of the disparities in sentence length. It's a report that's been 4 years in the making and was originally commissioned by Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice Ralph Gantz, who died this week at age 65. After we learned that Massachusetts sentencing disparities were even worse than the national average. Chief Justice Gantz gave the Harvard researchers unprecedented access to state criminal records in hopes they could figure out why that was. But because of inadequacies in court data tracking and little to no cooperation from the state's police and prosecutors, there was ultimately a lot they could not look at. As retired federal judge Nancy Gertner wrote in a recent Boston Globe op-ed, the study, quote, could not analyze the skewed pipeline that led to court to begin with, namely policing and prosecutorial decisions. And in another Globe op-ed, Suffolk County District Attorney Rachael Rollins, along with former state reps Byron Rushing and Juana Matias, called the lack of data an embarrassment, arguing the study's findings, quote, show that the Commonwealth makes it nearly impossible to pinpoint when and where the law and those who enforce it are failing to provide equal treatment. Rachael Rollins and Nancy Gertner join me now. Thanks so much, you two, for being here.
Good to be on.
Before we start, I know you both had a relationship with the Chief Justice who obviously commissioned this report. Starting with you, District Attorney, can you give us a minute on the passing of Ralph Gantz?
This is so profoundly just heart-wrenching, and not just because he was a wonderful man, but he led our judiciary on the state side with dignity and compassion. He did so many firsts, which I know Judge Gertner is going to speak about, but even the statement our SJC issued after the murder of George Floyd, he was thoughtful, and even when we look at this study from Harvard Law School, the fact that he 4 years ago, prior to many people speaking about these issues, gave them unfettered access and asked for this to be looked into in a meaningful way. We have a huge hole in our hearts as the legal community, and these are going to be enormous shoes to fill.
Judge Gertner?
Well, I mean, when you talk about systemic and institutional racism, he was someone who was going to take that on. The SJC was the first court to deal with COVID-19 in prisons. The SJC was the first court to have a meaningful eyewitness identification task force. His leadership looked at wrongful convictions. So he was not just the judge who was going to be fabulous in his opinions. He was going to figure out sort of proactively what was wrong and right about those systems. So, I mean, he was really extraordinary.
Judge Gertner, starting with you, speaking of this study, is there anything, I understand the hard numbers are news, is there anything you didn't know that you learned from this report, or was this all obvious to you as a participant in and an observer of the criminal justice system here?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The thing that was the hardest to deal with was the complete lack of data. I mean, when you think about it, you talk about policing and the way to control discretion by police and racial discretion, and the way to do that with prosecutors and the way to do that with courts is to have access to the patterns and the data. And the Harvard study researchers could not even trace a case from charge, easily trace a case from charge to conviction, because the records were all all messed up. And so that was actually stunning. What they did with what they had was remarkable. The underlying conclusion, which is that the mandatory minimums were accounted for a substantial amount of the variance, and the people who got the mandatory minimums were more likely to be people of color. And even when blacks and whites got the same charge, blacks were in there for longer. Were sentenced for longer.
But in your op-ed, and I just quoted from it, what's missing, when you don't know the decisions that were made by the police, and you don't know the decisions that were made by prosecutors that got you into that pipeline, Judge, that you're referencing a minute ago, how is one able to make an assessment of the system and fix it? Judge Gertner.
Well, that was the takeaway, which is that the initial charge, and particularly the mandatory minimums, were responsible for over 70% of the disparity. And what that meant is that even if every case was plea bargain, you were starting off, if you were Black or Latinx, with a very different set of cards. So yes, the question is who got charged, what they got charged with, and then who got arrested. And that, of course, they got no cooperation with prosecutors and with most police departments.
And DA Rollins,
we cooperate.
For you, yes, for you.
But Rachael Rollins, when I was reading your op-ed about the very point that Judge Gertner is talking about, the missing data without which you can't pinpoint the source of the problem and address it, if you choose to, I'm reading the first half of your op-ed and I'm saying, doesn't this woman know about the criminal justice reform law that passed in 2018 that mandates that this data be made available? And I read another paragraph to see you talk about that. Where's the disconnect? What happened with the statutory obligation to produce this data and the failure to produce it? What happened?
Well, let's just be clear, Jim. Learning now as an elected official, if we have legislation that has no language about who's paying for it or who's enforcing it, it's not worth the sheet of paper that it's on. And what we are dealing with right now is a sort of who's on first situation where who is responsible for gathering all of this information. Many of us read it as EOPS. Or, a large state entity that has statewide oversight. Again, I'm not saying I need any more work, but I'm just the DA of Suffolk County. I can't control basically what's happening maybe even in my office, let alone what's happening around the rest of the state right now. So what we need is somebody to take the lead in this process, whether it's the trial court, whether it's EOPS, or whether it's all of us meeting together. And what I can say, Jim, is in the landmark lawsuit that CPCS and MACDL filed for the imprisoned individuals during COVID-19, we pointed this out in our pleading, that there was a lack of data. We're scrambling to find out who is incarcerated, who is being held, and for what. I'm the DA of Suffolk County, and I should know that at the snap of a finger, we should be able to get that information. We don't.
Judge Gertner, what were you saying?
Well, I said, isn't it amazing that when they were talking, they wanted to deal with people who were on the cusp of release, people that had only short term left on the cusp of release. Give me those people because they could be at risk for COVID and at least reduce the overcrowding. And they couldn't come up with the names.
Not to mention there were some 300 people that had already been granted parole, but were waiting for their papers, which is a 3 to 4 to 5 week process that was just log jammed in there. And we found out so much information, Jim, even in that 4+ hour hearing that we had with Chief Justice Gantz and the entire SJC on that litigation. So
Rachael Rollins, who can fix this data absence? Is it the governor? Is that who needs to step in?
So what I think needs to happen is our data collection system is archaic. Right. And so what we need is either the MDAA, the Mass District Attorneys Association, and our legislature to put forth the money necessary to get us a new system. I am very proud, Jim, that I am not a patient person, and I have moved forward on behalf of Suffolk County and have secured outside funding so that we can get our data up to speed and in this century.
Can we address an issue that we haven't talked about in this discussion? the study concludes something, as we said, we all knew about the gross racial disparities in the criminal justice system. It's clear that one piece of the puzzle is who sits in front of the courtroom, like you once did, Judge Gertner. The most recent data that I have seen is roughly 10 to 11% of the judges in Massachusetts state courts are people of color. And look at the SJC, by the way. In the last 328 years, the oldest high court in the country, 3 black justices ever, 10 female justices ever, 0 Latinx justices. And right now, and by the way, Justice Lank is retired, even though she hasn't gone yet. So once she is gone, 4 of the 5 justices, former prosecutors, only 1 black justice, only 2 female justices. Rachael Rollins, you wrote a letter in early August, from what I understand, to the governor saying, get with the program here. We need more diversity. And you weren't just talking about race. What were you talking about, and what did you hear from the governor?
Well, so we are talking about criminal defense lawyers. We are talking about people with a lived experience. As a former prosecutor myself, but as somebody who is proud to have been a criminal defense lawyer as well, they are brilliant people, and they are handling every single case that we handle on the other side of the V. So they need to be up there making these decisions. Yes, it is important that we have representation on the bench, but we need a lived experience. And Jim, what I can tell you with just Judge Gertner here, as well as Chief Justice Gantz, cultural competency is one of the most important things imaginable on the bench. When you have a bench that is disassociated, that has never actually interacted in a functional or non-criminal matter or way with certain populations, it is really hard for them to make decisions where the only time they see certain communities is when they are in front of them as a standing defendant. And so I can tell you, Jim, as the only person of color of the 11 DAs in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the first woman in the history of Suffolk County to be DA and woman of color in the history of the Commonwealth, we have to do much better. Our governor's council has not a single person of color on it. The 15 people that decide who is the head of CPCS, not particularly diverse. Our judicial nominating commission, not diverse. And additionally, in Superior Court, 3 black judges out of the 80 plus judges. Yes, Governor Baker himself did not get back to me, but Bob Ross, his chief legal counsel, did, and we had a wonderful conversation. They are looking and working very hard on this.
Judge Gertner, as I said, 3 black justices ever. Charlie Baker, after he is appointed the replacement for Justice Lank and Chief Justice Gantz, will have, I don't know if any governor's ever done this, have appointed all 7 of the justices in the state's highest court. What's that? John Hancock?
John Hancock.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay, I missed him. You were around for him. Obviously, I was not. So, two things. One, what does Baker have to look for in the future going forward? And 2, how has he done so far with the 5 appointments he's made?
So going forward, so one of the things that Elizabeth Warren did looking for fill the 2 vacancies on the Massachusetts District Court was diversity of experience. And so that means that you have a bench that includes criminal defense lawyers, labor lawyers, legal services lawyers, diversity of experience. Diversity of gender and race is important, but diversity of experience is critical. It's really a version of what Rachael is saying. In addition, there's something really wrong about, in my view, about picking higher court judges from the lower court bench. Because what that does is it encourages a bench to be conservative. If you really want to go up the line, the last thing you want to do is do anything dramatic. And so that, it seems to me that he should look outside the group of existing judges. He should look at diversity of experience, and there should be an appointment particularly to replace the irreplaceable Judge Gantz. Someone that when he names the name people say, of course, and not she is or he is. And that's what we need, because this was the court.
So are you saying, Justice Gertner, are you saying that the governor has fallen short in his first 5 appointments, or what are you saying?
Well, the first 5 appointments were mostly prosecutors. Many were people that did not have a very substantial reputation in the legal community, and not particularly diverse. So you get a court that will decide things, but will not have the leadership. This was the court that declared the death penalty unconstitutional in Massachusetts, that protected the right to choose in Massachusetts. So this is a really remarkable court, and the people on it should be remarkable.
Both of you, I've only have
if
one.
I could just add
Quickly.
one of the things
Quickly.
that, Justice Cordy and Justice Marshall, I believe, had never served as judges before, ended up being very good jurists, of course. We need to think outside the box here. And if we are going to have our first Latinx, which I sincerely hope justice on the SJC, or a more diverse bench with respect to Black or Latinx individuals, criminal defense lawyers that actually reflect the bar, I think we have to think outside of the box. I completely agree with Judge Gertner that it should not be, you've served this many years on the Mass Appeals Court and now you're automatically going up. And I'll be honest, the list we saw prior to the governor reopening the application process with respect to Justice Lenk, I don't believe could fill the shoes of a Chief Justice Gantz. And so we need people with cultural competence. It was not a diverse group of individuals. Had they checked some boxes, yes, but I don't think they could even hold a match to a Chief Justice Gantz.
Rachael, Rollins, we only have 30 seconds left. Very quickly, I put Nancy Gertner on the spot about the SJC. Let me put you on the spot about the legislature fixing the shortcomings you mentioned a minute ago. They still haven't been able to report out a police reform bill, and it's now mid-September. Do you have faith that they have the will to fix what ails the reporting that you talked about quickly?
I'm cautiously optimistic that they have the will. I will say that I'm excited that I look at the city of Boston, and Councilor Campbell, Arroyo, and Mejia have done some work there, as have Mayor Walsh. So Suffolk County might get what we need, but we need the legislature to move quicker, and this needs to happen. And the stalling is going to result in the status quo remaining.
Rachael Rollins, Nancy Gertner, as always, thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.